With this week's episode of Gakkou Gurashi, we get our main focus on Miki this week. And going by the previous episodes of this series, each individual episode has focused on our characters. First episode, Yuki. Second episode, other characters, and so forth, so on. For instance, the perspective of each individual episode is shifting to the other characters, which this is actually a good thing. That means that from what we can expect from this series, or this anime series, is that it's going to give, I guess, level characterization. For instance, it's going to shift over to all our characters and focus on them and give them characterization instead of just one main character. For instance, I thought that Yuki, since she was, the main character of the first episode, that she would get the main focus throughout this entire series. But from what we're getting from these past couple episodes is that Gakkou Gurashi is not just focusing on Yuki. Even though she might be the main character in a sense because of her condition, the main characters of this series is everyone. And I like that so much. I like how each individual character gets their own episode to shine, get to find out more about their past, how they got in their situation, and get to see what drives them to continue to survive. And that is exactly what this week's episode is. So it follows the exact same formula as the previous episodes have done, except it does it in a different way. For instance, it shows what happened before the outbreak and after it happened to the outbreak. Even though last week's episode focused on Megane and got to showcase kind of what happened and how she got to where she was, this week's episode focuses on Miki, and we come to find out that she was not a part of the school at the time of the outbreak, which leaves a lot of, questions we need to wonder about right now, because this episode, it actually fooled me. I thought the episode had Miki around. Like, I thought Miki was a part of the, the school at the moment in this episode. But this episode actually takes place in the past. It flops back and forth between before the outbreak, after the outbreak. That's exactly what this episode does. And it can be very confusing depending on how you look at this episode, because I didn't really realize it until the halfway point that this episode is kind of like not present day. Like, this episode takes place before episode 1. That's exactly where this episode takes place. So, it's very weird if you start figuring about that. You'd think this type of episode would have been done first, but yeah, the point still stands though. This episode takes place before episode 1 because you have it to where we get to see before the outbreak in the mall with Miki. She's with her friend, Kay, I think that's her name. I don't remember. Starts with a K. And you see it to where they get, in the middle of this outbreak in the mall, they have to lock themselves up in a room, and they stay there for many, many days, because you see these water bottles piling up, and that represents how many days they've been around. If we consider the normal human body probably drinks 2 to 3 bottles a day, and you saw a bunch of bottles, probably about 20 bottles each of them, that's quite a few days if you think about it. So they were sitting in that room for quite a while, and you have to wonder, is that girl that was with Miki dead? Like, is she dead? Is she, alive? Because we didn't really get to see confirmation if she was dead or not, because from what we saw was that Miki was in the room with, her friend, I'm guessing childhood friend or best friend from school. They locked themselves up in the room. Eventually, the friend wanted to leave and go because no help was coming after many, many days. And she promised her friend Miki, like, okay, so if I find help, I'll tell them to come here and save you. And she went off on her own. And we don't really know if she died or if she lived on. And from what we also got from the way this episode was done is that the dog was also with Miki at the beginning of the series. So we come to find out how they got their dog as well. So Miki and the dog came around a part of our group of main characters at the exact same time, and we come to find out why the dog does not like Miki, because in the first episode, if you remember, even after that actually, in episode 2 and 3, you get to see where the dog doesn't want nothing to do with Miki at all. Like, it turns its head and just runs away from her, or just doesn't do nothing at all. It's because that Miki yelled at the dog. Like you saw in this episode where she yelled at the dog, scared the dog, and then the dog ran away. You see how it went through the window and followed after the other girl. And I'm willing to bet something else probably happened too, probably in next week's episode. Judging by the way this episode was done, I'm going to assume next week's episode is going to carry on after what the events of this episode happen. For instance, next week is going to continue to where our characters go on their trip inside of the town, along with, how Miki's in that room. I feel like that we're going to get to see the encounter of how Miki met, I guess Yuki and them when they went to their trip in town, probably to get supplies from the mall, and that's what we're probably going to see next week. Now, I wonder, though, if we will get to see if that girl is dead or not. If I had to be a judge of circumstances, I'm going to say that she died. I think that girl died, because if she is still around in that, area, if there is still zombies around, which we know there was, and zombies don't just disappear, I'm going to assume that the girl died, and we're probably going to see a corpse next week, and the dog is probably going to be around that girl's corpse, or somewhere around that girl, walked away. Miki's going to save the dog, and then she's probably going to go with Yuki and them to the school. One of those things are probably going to happen, so that's my theory on that. Overall, though, the episode structure, same exact theme from what we come to know from the series, so it's nothing different in that kind of fashion. I do like the way the series is going, though. I like the way it does its tone shifts. I really like the comedy tone shift to the serious tone shifts. It really adds this different dynamic to the series that is different from many series I've watched in recent times, because there's one thing that really detaches me away from anime, and it's definitely tone shifts. And I don't talk about this topic much. I have mentioned it many times before in some of my reviews I have done. For instance, like Punchline, I think it was episode 4 or 5. Depending on tone shifts, it can really just agitate me as an anime watcher, in my personal opinion. It agitates me if tone shifts are not done right, because it just grabs me out of the experience and I don't feel what I should feel. For instance, when you have a scene that has a bunch of comedy and you're laughing your ass off, and then all of a sudden, less than 30 seconds later, switches over into something creepy and serious, depending on how that's done, I can't take it as serious, and it just doesn't fit right to me to where I can enjoy it. And so I have to really say, when it comes to Gakkou Gurashi, when it comes to the tone shifts, it does a really good job at it, from switching from the moe comedy to these serious zombie scenes where you see our characters running through freaking zombies trying to get to a car. And that's exactly what this episode did. Now, one thing I want to mention before I end this review and, I guess get ready for Rampo to come out later today, if you notice, when Yuki and them got in Megune's car, I noticed it, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, but if you look closely in that scene, as I said in my last review, I theorize that Megune most likely is dead, and which I hope not, because she's a good character, but I theorize most likely she's dead. If you look at the scene to when the girls get into the car, Megune's car, Megune is in the back seat, and there's two things you can get from that. For one, if you look closely, you see how the characters get in the car, and you hear the door closing sound, like you hear the doors close. You don't see Megune get into the car, she just appears there in the car. And also, if you look closely, all the other characters have seatbelts on, but Megune doesn't. Think about it. So, episode of Gurashi this week, I enjoyed it. I cannot wait for next week's episode. I love this series so much. Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Please be safe. Chibi out.